Hey everyone, Drew Dinkmeyer here at Establish the Run with part 2 of the question and answer session on the screencast for using an optimizer in DFS and general strategy around MME and thought processes when playing mass multi-entry. In this screencast, I will feature the Fantasy Labs product, which we have a promotional deal with. I will link it in the YouTube comments. I will also link it on the tweet that I send out. But for $30 a month, you get access to the Fantasy Labs optimizer preloaded with our projections at Establish the Run. And you can do all of these cool and unique tricks and things to be able to enter mass multi-entry lineups. But let's start off and get to the questions. The first, there's only a few questions, but I think they're worthwhile to spend some time on today. From Ethan Schutler, and sorry Ethan if I'm mispronouncing your name. Hope I'm not too late to this. I didn't have any right away, but just thought of one after looking at my showdown results last night. Wondering how you assess a successful week agnostic of money won. I know you mentioned in your first video that you are looking for more lineups in the top 1% than would be expected, and if it's that simple then cool, but didn't know if you dove deeper into the exposures you had to analyze potential MME mistakes made. I seem to consistently be roughly breaking even on MME, but always have a couple of lineups. It basically goes on to say always have a couple of lineups that are just a few pieces away. And the first thing that I'd respond to that with is if you're consistently breaking even on MME, you're doing very well. Generally, you should understand that your assumption on any tournament that you play, if you are kind of a net neutral player, would be losing the rake or the site fees associated with it. And most of the site fees associated with these tournaments are somewhere in the range of 15 to 20%, right? So if you're breaking even consistently in MME fields, you're doing pretty well. In terms of the distribution of the scores and whether that's going to allow you to potentially hit something big over time is what he's referencing in terms of how I like to look at my play. And so I use RotoTracker. They have a free version available, but I have so many entries and so many contests that I pay for their subscription. And this is one of the pages that you can go to. If you go to graphs and you go to finish position, you can look at GPP sizes, and I've got this sorted into 1% buckets. And there's a couple of things I want to kind of show here. First of all, this is all of my results over DFS time, and what this is showing is I get, over time I've had 1.6% of my entries in the top 1% of contests, which is really, really good. And that, to me, the slope of this graph, the fact that I am producing more results at kind of each entry level above the 50% mark, and fewer results below the 50% mark, to me suggests there's an edge. But this is counting all of my results since the start of DFS, and DFS continues to get more and more challenging each and every year. So one of the things that I wanted to show was just the difference between the entry date. So if I choose a date of January 1st, 2018, so the last 3 years, watch how this chart moves, right? So what's going to happen is if it were getting easier, if I was getting better, however you want to look at it at DFS, the slope of this chart would become more intensified. It would become more upright. If it's getting more difficult, the slope of this chart will flatten. So just watch what happens when we select a date, right? So I'm still doing well, but definitely not as strong an edge. I'm still generating 1.6% lineups in the top 1%, but you can see overall kind of my lineups are not as dominant as they were in the past. And so that's one thing that I wanted to highlight just in general is I think there's a lot of different tools in the industry that can help you get better as a DFS player, but a lot of people are also getting better and the field is getting sharper. And so you have to think of ways to continually try to stay ahead of the field. The question that came in was with regards to Showdown. And so thankfully I can filter by Showdown, but there is something that I want to talk about after I set the filter in terms of week to week and different things. So I'll do Showdown Captain. So this is DraftKings, and this is across all contests. And you can see one, it's a little bit flatter in terms of the slope of this line, but the slope of the line is generally in the right direction, right? And again, I'm at about 1.5%, which is really, really good, and I'm really happy with those results. And this is, again, for the last 3 years. But the thing about Showdown that you have to remember, and why it's very difficult to look at things on a week-to-week basis, is so many of the lineups in Showdown are duplicated heavily, right? So it's harder to understand how good of a lineup you created when there's a chance that it's the 5th or 6th best lineup on the slate and it might not be in the top 1% of all lineups. because there's a big train of duplicates that happens to finish in the top 1%. And so I think this type of analysis for Showdown is very difficult to do on small samples. You need to kind of expand it out over time before you can kind of get an idea of whether you're creating an edge in that contest or not. Because what you'll see is, like, for instance, if I change this entry date to like just the last week of Showdown's results, or even just this year's worth of Showdown results, you'll see things that are very, very clumpy. And it's because of that issue that I just referred to, right? So see how these are all really, really clumpy? And that's because the duplicates create these natural gaps kind of in the percentiles. So you really need a bigger sample to try to assess that. The question also sort of gets to the idea of, and I'm gonna sort this back just because I think I might use it again during this screencast. But the question also gets to the idea of how do you analyze plays or your overall play on a given week-to-week basis? And it's a really tough question for me to answer because I've come to the place where I believe in the projection work that I'm doing, and I believe in the way that I'm constructing the lineups in a correlated manner, that I believe that process is very fruitful over time. And on a week-to-week basis, I might get the plays wrong. I might not have the results that I want. And I think that's often too small of a sample to be analyzing. And so I don't analyze myself on a week-to-week basis. I analyze myself over kind of rolling periods of seasons. And so in this season, now that we have, 5 weeks, I'll start to look, okay, am I still generating the types of lineups in the top 1% that I'd like to? In terms of analyzing the individual plays, I think this is where a lot of people get stuck in DFS. And because it's really hard to separate if a good play was a good process and a bad result, or if it was a good result and a bad process. And very few people ever look at, was that a good result and a bad process? People generally just take the good result and credit themselves, take the bad results and credit variance. So I think it's something that's very difficult to do effectively. And so I don't do it too much. But as an example, like Cam Akers last week, I recommended on the Establish the Million show, and I played probably 10% Cam Akers. So it was like 10 times the field on Cam Akers. He only got 6 touches. And so immediately you could classify that as a bad process, right? You never want to invest in a player that's only going to get 6 touches. But on the other hand, you could look at it as Darrell Henderson scored 2 touchdowns. I knew that backfield was going to create fantasy points. I got the low-owned, cheapest piece of it and took a chance that maybe he'll get more carry than he did, more playing time than he did earlier in the season. It wouldn't be as much of a split, and that didn't work out. And you could say, okay, that's a good process then. So I think people get hung up too much on analyzing their individual plays at the end of a slate. I think when you want to analyze your plays is right when you see lock and you see the percentage owned next to them. And so for me, some of the things that stood out was like, okay, if Cam Akers was 8% owned last week, that would have been a terrible play for me because I was assuming the only reason I was playing him was because I thought he was like 1% owned or less. Zacchaeus, the Atlanta wide receiver, was like 35% owned in DK GPPs last week. I think that's a bad play at that ownership. I had 18%, so I was half the field. And at 18%, when he's 36, I probably won't want to be even lower in general. But those are the times to assess the plays. If you do it after the fact, you can kind of twist yourself in circles and in knots, trying to identify what's a good player, what's not. And I think a lot of people too often spend way too much time focusing on the result of a play and whether it was good or not based on it than they do thinking about constructing lineups as a whole and if their lineups made sense, if the correlation that they were putting in their lineups made sense, and if it was giving them the shot to ascend the leaderboard if they got things right. Did your lineup have enough correlation? Were there enough low-owned pieces that if those low-owned pieces hit, you can ascend the leaderboard? Those are the things that I think you should be analyzing week to week. The next question that I got was from Jay Webster. Jimmy, and I think Jimmy had a big hit in MME last week. I think he might have won the slant. So shout out to Jimmy. if I have that right, and I'm pretty sure that I do. He said, I know you guys talked a bit about this and then established the not Milky, week 3, I believe it was, but been thinking about rules for double stacking versus skinny stacks. Example given, rule does double stack but exclude some teams and have rule for single stack as well. Can you speak to this a bit more? Like, I know that would be a week-to-week decision based on how the slate is shaping up. A good way to add correlation leverage but still play chalk. If the stack should be lesser owned, would that maybe lead to a skinny stack being more okay? All right, so there's lots to tackle here in terms of kind of how we think about stacks. And you can, for the optimizer part of this, you can set this up in the settings on Fantasy Labs through the positional stuff, where you can make a rule that says pair quarterback with at least one wide receiver or tight end. And then you can make a second rule that's pair quarterback with at least 2. And when I go 2, I like to include the running backs in there as well. But you cannot. And then you can include the teams that you like to do that for. And so let me talk a little bit about how I think about this generally. The first thing that I think about in terms of segregating these options into single stacks or double stacks are, will that quarterback, I think of it from the quarterback perspective, will that quarterback need multiple pass catchers to go off for them to have a week that is a GPP winning week? And so the way that I think of that is price, and how do they accumulate their value, right? So high-priced quarterbacks that don't run a ton are immediate double stacks for me, right? That would be Patrick Mahomes. That would be potentially, formerly Dak Prescott. Even though he does run some, I don't think he has so much rushing ceiling that a fair amount of his games are going to be decided just by his legs. That would be like Jared Goff, Carson Wentz, Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers, those types of options. Now, Aaron Rodgers is one exception that I will sometimes limit the single stack to, because I think he has one wide receiver that can take so much of that value. But when you start to think like that, you recognize that I should still always double stack Aaron Rodgers, because if he's single stacked with Davante Adams, yes, Davante Adams going nuts elevates Aaron Rodgers' score, but really it's harder to set. It's still not that great from separating from the field. You really want those games where there's 2 guys separating from the field. So almost always for me, pocket passing oriented quarterbacks, I'm going to double stack, especially high priced ones. Single stack characters for me are rushing oriented quarterbacks that also have a tight concentrated target share. And so the immediate option, who's not on this main slate this week, for me would be Kyler Murray. Kyler Murray is almost always going to be a single stack candidate for me. So I would include I would not include Kyler Murray here, but I would include Dak, Matt Stafford, Aaron Rodgers, these types of guys in double stacks. Pocket passers that I'm going to single stack would have to be really cheap, really, really cheap. So like Kyle Allen last week, and I know he got a rushing touchdown, but he was 4,100. I'm not looking for Kyle Allen to generate 30 fantasy points. And if he generated 30 fantasy points, he'd probably be supporting 2 pass catchers, right? But if he generates 18 at 4,100, I could maybe win the week still. And so I'm okay with 1 pass catcher being the guy that can get him to 18. And so that's the way that I think through these things. I try to think through, what is the scenario that is most likely to end up in kind of the winning lineup, and what scenario can effectively elevate everyone else around them. And that's why sometimes on the Establish the Million show, Mike and I have talked about situations where there might be a really cheap quarterback that sets up well as a single stack option, and you can still consider double stacking from a different game with a high-priced quarterback, where the example last week would have been, you could use, let's say, Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce in the same lineup with a Kyle Allen single stack, right? Because Kyle Allen can get enough. He's not going to beat Mahomes, but he can get enough that the value created from him can get close enough, and then you can still get the Mahomes exposure through the double expensive stack. There's things that you can do like that, but you have to think through the price tag associated of the stack combination as a whole. And this is another thing. why Dak was lower owned in higher stake stuff last week was because the pricing on Dak and the receivers was a little bit prohibitive because the receivers weren't great values. And so you want to think of the quarterback's price, you want to think of the wide receiver's price associated with them, how much is needed to support all these options, and these are kind of the ways that I think about kind of single or double stacking. I'm just going to reread the question really quickly to see if there's anything else that I missed there that I could further clarify. So one of the questions was around ownership. Are single stacks kind of more viable with lesser owned options? And I think generally yes, but I would still leave that a little bit more on the periphery of the first decision, which is what is necessary for this quarterback to be elevated to be a GPP winning play. And the more expensive the quarterback is elevated to do that, the more pass catchers you're going to want to support him unless he can get it on his own with his legs. But if those stacks are chalky, like if a Kyler Murray nuke stack is chalky with a single stack, it's probably less appealing to me to play. Because if both of those options, if Kyler's going to be like 18% and Hopkins is going to be like 35% on a given week, then both of those options now, when they hit, when I get that right, I'm not really adding any value above the field. And so I am less likely to play skinny, expensive, high-owned stacks, right? Those are tough to beat the field on. So I'm less likely to play those in general. If, for instance, like last week I played probably 6 to 7% of Jimmy Garoppolo because I had a lot of Kittle, and that was like a cheap quarterback that could be elevated by his skill catcher, and I played those as single stacks. I was more likely to play those because Jimmy Garoppolo was coming with low ownership, even though Kittle was coming with kind of elevated ownership. So I do think the ownership plays a role in the decision, but I think it's kind of the last decision in terms of the number of stackable candidates that you'll use with it. Next question from Aaron Jones, A. Jones Lego, one of the best DFS players in the world over the last few years, has the biggest win, I believe, in DFS because I think he took down the $4 million, I think it was $4 million first place prize on DraftKings a few years ago. Aside from ownership constraints, how do you make sure to have more even distribution of high value plays so that your bottom lineups aren't too spicy? Can you tell Labs to stop limiting if-then groups that aren't boosts? I think Labs increased those to 50. They were like around 12 to 14, 15, something like that. So you can do more of those. But in terms of how I go about considering my lineups, and unfortunately I don't have all my rules built out to look to do this quickly in a way. But I'll create 150 and I'll just take you kind of through my process really, really quickly in terms of how I go about this. And we'll just set up some basic rules to work with. This will be, a test run and certainly not something that necessarily is what I'm going to use at the end of the week because I just haven't looked into this week deep enough. But this should give an example of like these are general ballparks of rules that I'm using kind of on a given week of positional limits and correlation and different things like that. And I'll just set some of these up and we'll go through and we'll try to run some of these, and I'll show kind of what I look at with lineups. And so right now what I'm trying to do here is I'll just leave that at least 1, 2 per QB with at least one running back, wide receiver, tight end from opponent team. What I'm trying to do now is just create like a shell of what lineups would kind of look like for me. And so I can use this as an example. Again, this isn't exactly how it'll end up being, but this is kind of some of the rules that I use as like staples each and every week. And I'll talk through these as I'm going, but I never want a QB with the defense from the same team. If the defense is doing really well, usually the QB's volume is suppressed. And so I don't want that. I don't want a D. I'll allow a wide receiver against my opposing D on DraftKings. I won't allow a QB, a running back, or a tight end generally because those positions, their upside comes through a lot of scoring and touchdowns. And usually that's bad against my defense if that's happening. Those are negatively correlated. I want my QB with at least one opponent, and I'm gonna make these at least 2 for now. Sometimes I will split those out between 1s and 2s, but just for clarity's sake, I'll do that now. And then we'll say that I won't do player correlations, but I'll do a custom rule that I want at least one player where the projected ownership is less than 5%, and we'll run 150, and we'll look at the spiciness of the lineups towards the end of the set to get an idea of what things kind of look like here. And so I automatically see some rules coming through, and this is something that I'll do, but I automatically see some issues with some rules that came through, like this lineup here that might disappear. But that was a lineup that, as it got pushed down by projection, that was a lineup that had 2 Titans without the quarterback, right? So I see that immediately, and while I'll wait for this to finish, it goes a little bit slower while I'm screencasting, so I apologize for the timing. The Labs optimizer actually does work quicker than this. But so that would be an example where I saw that coming through. I don't think that I want 2 Titans. I have to think through that, and this is a decision I'd make later in the week. But I don't think that I want 2 Titans in the same lineup unless it's a game stack. So I would limit to at most 1 running back, wide receiver, tight end from the same team, unless paired with a quarterback from the same game, essentially. And so we'll just run that again real quickly, and we'll see what we come up with in terms of, and this is where you can add more. This is in the part 1, I said you can run lineup sets with different rules and then kind of group them together, but I'm just going to start over and run another 150 here. And now we'll have solved that problem. But the question, Aaron's original question is like, at the bottom of your lineup set, if you over restrict things, you'll get some weird lineups, right? And you want to kind of manage how weird you want your lineups to be. And I think that's a really important thing to consider, because I think people just run and they upload and they don't even like look through the lineups. And I think part of the process of being a good MME player is not giving away lineups, right? You'll see a lot of silly conversation around MME. Basically, whenever I post a screenshot, or anyone posts a screenshot of MMEs on Twitter, you'll see a lot of stuff where people are like, oh, if you have 150 entries, it's a print fest, you can win every week and all that stuff. And if you've tried MME, if you've played it, you understand that that's not the case. There is an advantage to having a lineup set, but the advantage is only executed when you're making lineup 150 as strong as lineup 1. And mathematically, it's hard to do that, right? Because every projected lineup you make is projecting for a little bit less. You can see that, right? These are projections. They project for less. But what you can do is you can recognize that if they're not projecting so far apart, that the variance in the game will allow some of these lineups that project worse to elevate above. And so that's how you create the added value. But to do that, you need to make sure lineup 150 is as good as lineup 1. And so what I do is I start scrolling through these lineups to see, like, what are the things that are happening here? What are some of my rules making happen in these lineups? And I'll look at my player exposures to see, like, okay, I have 21% Myles Gaskin. I don't even know how good of a play Myles Gaskin is this week. Maybe he's a great play. They're going against the Jets. He probably is a pretty good play. But that might be something that stuck out to me. Or anytime I see a name that's just a little bit unusual for the amount that I'm playing, I'll like double check like what's going on. And sometimes like, okay, Damiere Byrd, I've got 10% of Damiere Byrd. So you can like look through the lineups and try to figure out. So I'll search for Byrd and figure out like, why am I getting so much Damiere Byrd? Okay, he's 2 to 4% projected ownership, right? I made a rule that said I need one player of at least sub 5% owned in. So I'm telling the optimizer, hey, give me someone who's less than 5%. And the optimizer is probably telling me that Damiere Byrd is one of the best options who's sub 5% owned. But do I want that much Damiere Byrd? And these are the types of things that I kind of go through when I'm looking at my lineups. Now back to Aaron's original question, which is like, how do you make sure things aren't too spicy towards the bottom end? And basically the thing that I do is I go back down to my last lineup set here, and I look through these lineups and like, do these look representative of the types of lineups that I want? Do I want Dolphins Jet stacks? Do I want Jags double stacks? these types of things, and then I make my decision. What I also will do is I'll look at the projected gap in projected points difference. So here we're at 127, my last lineup. It's only projected to be 49% owned. This is very contrarian, right? It's projected for 127 points. And my top lineup is projected for 150 points. So I'm giving up 23 points on 150. And so like rough math, that's 1/6 of projection I'm giving up. So that's like 18%. I'm giving up 18% of a projection for the added variance. And generally that's like on the fringe. I'd like to keep it within 15% if I can, but I'm building so many lineups. Like in a 150 set, I'd try to keep it around 15%. But when I'm generating like 500 lineups, I'm going to get that wider range. And so the big thing is you don't want this to be like half. Right? Then you've kind of gone off the reservation. Okay, now you're expecting a lineup to be able to outproduce the rest of your lineups that are projecting 2 times as good as it. That's probably unlikely. But 18 points, I can probably make up 18 points on variance. So that's kind of the way that I go through checking these things. And I wanted to get back to that Damiere Byrd point just to check out like what kind of value is Damiere Byrd look like this week? Does he look like a really good value that I can have 10% of? Or does he look like somebody that is just getting kind of put in the optimizer because of the constraint that I made? And so I'll check on points per salary. It's a very rudimentary way to check because the cheap guys always flow up in points per salary. That's why we have a different value formula on the Establish the Run site. But he looks like a decent play, right? He's projected for 10 points. That's fine. So I'll have 10% of a guy priced near the minimum that's projected for 10 points. But sometimes when you have this constraint in, and let's say there's like no other good plays, right? There's actually some decent cheap guys this week. But let's say Daryl Mooney was like the best guy and there were no other 3K guys and pricing was really tight on the slate and I was getting like 30% Daryl Mooney. Then I'd go remove that rule or up the rule to like, let's say less than 8% because we've got these projected as ranges, right? So less than 5 is going to give me everybody in the 2 to 4s as at least one in my lineup. Less than 8 will expand out to this 5 to 8 range. And I do stuff like that on a week-to-week basis to kind of check through my lineups. Next question. How differently would your approach building for 20 max versus 150? So the answer to that question is my approach would not be any different. The results of my approach would be different, right? Because if I'm running for just 20 lineups, well, I guess I should say my approach would be a little bit different. I would try to take on a little bit more concentration. I might make my ownership levels on the wide receivers, my restrictions, go closer to like 30, 40%, something like that, because I'd recognize that I only have 20 bullets to fire. And if I only have 20 bullets to fire, I want to take some more concentrated decisions in terms of how I'm going about things. I would still correlate things the same way. I'd still use kind of the same levels of variance, but I would allow for my lineups to be a little bit more correlated. And I might tighten up my quarterback choices. That's kind of how I'd go differently between 20 max and 150 max. When I make all my lineups, I'm just randomly assigning which ones get into 20 max and 150 max. But if I only had 20 to play, I would be a little bit more stringent or a little bit looser on the constraints that I'm using. Matt Nelson asks, wondering if you typically reduce your player pool via exclusions or just tweak your rules until naturally you get to a player pool you like. That's a good question. So this is where I start. I start things pretty broad. I don't mess with the player pool until I've optimized off of broad-based rules. Then I look through and filter through the exposures that I'm getting, and then I kind of work my way down. The one exception is sometimes I will just start with choosing my quarterbacks first. But generally, that's the only exception. So like I'll scroll through this list and like, okay, I'm getting Tim Patrick and James White. Are these guys that I want in my list or not? Do I think they have GPP winning upside? And you can see I have a lot of these plays like 1% owned and whatnot. That's where I'll start trimming and be like, okay, do I really want 6 1% owned guys, or do I want that 6% to go to somebody that I actually like feel pretty good about? And so I'll usually start with quarterbacks. That pairs down the stacks that I'm looking for. And basically I'll unselect all, and then I'll check the guys that I want on a given week. I haven't gotten to the final stages of building yet, so I don't know who I want yet on this week. I'm recording this very early in the week. But that's generally how I'll do. And then I'll run. And then I'll look at the running backs and decide, okay, are there any running backs here I want to nix out from my pool that I don't think they have GPP winning upside? Sometimes this helps. Sometimes you cut Rex Burkhead when he's a GPP winning play and the projections like him decently. But that's the way that I go about handling that. Next one. Chris Norris, third and fourth option wide receiver tight ends from chalky stacks, i.e. David Moore last week. Would you rather include them in your pool only with QB opposing QB to differentiate, or find differentiation elsewhere outside of the stack? Good question. I'm trying to think of the best way to answer this. But if they don't, I let the projections decide is really the best way to answer this. If they don't project really well, they're only going to get in on my stacks with the team, because if I'm playing like 20% Russell Wilson stacks in this David Moore example, and I'm limiting myself to 20% of DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, and I'm saying double stack Russell Wilson, well, maybe all 20% are just those three guys, but sometimes it's probably going to be someone else chosen because the optimizer has used Metcalf or Lockett in a different lineup already. And that's when I'll get in some David Moore, some Will Dissly, some guys like that. If they don't project well enough to get into lineups without the quarterback stacked, I generally just leave it, and I'm not too worried. There are times where I might bump a player's projection or boost them if I'm deciding that I want more exposure to them individually, but I'm not making that a specific decision tied to the quarterback that I'm using, unless I really, really want like a lot of varied iterations of that stack. Like I did that in week 3, I believe it was, with Dallas, where I wanted to use a lot of Dak stacks, and I bumped up the projection for Gallup and Lamb and Cooper and Schultz to make sure I was getting an array of them. I wasn't getting just Dak with his top two pass catchers. With spread out offenses, I'll do that. With concentrated offenses, I'll usually just leave it and let the projection go. All right. Do you make rules and groups per team for double stacks, or just rules that exclude a handful of teams? For example, Dallas had 3 viable wide receiver plus their tight end, but their running back will likely show up in a lot of optimals. Lamar, some weeks I want to pair just with tight end and no wide receiver. Yeah, sure. And you can do that through the team, I believe it's the team section, or the position section in terms of the rules, where you can include or exclude different stack types based on different teams. And that's all stuff that you can do to get your opinions through the optimizer, which is really what you're trying to use an optimizer for. And so for me, the examples that I'll use sometimes, like I've said before, if I have 2 chalky, high-priced quarterback running back pairs from a team I want to stack a lot, I will just make a rule, and I'll say at most one of I'm not sure who's on the slate, but let's say Rodgers and Aaron Jones. Right now, Rodgers and Aaron Jones are 2 guys because their offense is so concentrated. Like sometimes they do go off together. Dak and Zeke is the one that I've used before. I debated whether to use that rule with Patrick Mahomes and Clyde Edwards-Helaire last week, and I think looking back, I probably should have, even though I think Clyde Edwards-Helaire, his production can come in the passing game. I just think he was high-owned enough that I should be cognizant of that. But that's generally how I approach it. I generally approach it with running backs, high-priced running backs that are high-owned. I want them separated from their stack, because if they are really hitting that they're worthy of their price and worthy of that ownership, it's probably in a way that's pulling down the rest of their teammates. That's the way that I kind of think of that. Next question. Can you discuss why you prefer MME over high-stakes single-entry 3-max? Been struggling to figure out what is best for me. It has been fun to put together an MME set, but it seems you have to be so perfect. That is true. There's a lot of differences between high-stakes or single-entry 3-max contests and MME. The reason that I like MME for me is because I think I'm playing against the weakest competition on the site. I think casual players are generally playing in those contests where there's big prize pools up top for small amounts of dollars invested. And so I think a certain percentage of that player pool is non-competitive. And I think it's a smaller percentage in the single entry 3-max stuff as you kind of work up stakes. I do play single entry and 3-max. I often hand build those teams. And it does require a slightly different approach to MME, because you're picking specifically, you're not controlling exposures, right? Like if you play three max entry teams, you're at least minimum going to play 33% of everyone you choose. So it's a different approach. I do play both. I think there's merits to playing both. I think when you're starting out as a GPP player, you should try to focus on one thing, and honestly even one contest, and learn that contest and try to get really good at it. Whether you choose MME or single entry 3-max, totally up to you and whatever you're most comfortable with. In MME, you can bleed dollars much quicker because you're playing many more lineups. You can also hit for much higher prize pools, and that it's kind of a more volatile strategy. Single entry 3-max, you have to beat less of the field, so you are going to feel like you're more competitive more consistently. One of the other things I like about MME, usually it keeps me sweating throughout the games. Usually I have a lineup somewhere that kind of funnels up that I can kind of get behind, and I like that aspect as well. I'm curious how the mass entry guys decide what entries to put into what tournaments. For instance, you're saying 2 150 max, a handful of 20 max. How do you determine what lineups go into what tournaments? I'll hang up and listen, thanks. So for me, completely random. I make my lineups. If I have, in this instance, 2 150 max and let's say 220 max, that is 340 lineups that I need to make to fulfill those contests. I make 340 lineups. I upload those lineups and then I randomize them, and I enter them that way. I do think there's merit to making different lineup sets for specifically different types of contest structures. Like the Millie Maker probably deserves a different type of lineup set than a flatter payout structure. You should be willing to embrace more risk on the Millie Maker set. And I do think you can do things like that. It's advanced strategy. It requires a lot of time to really put those lineups apart. And you can do that through kind of the add more function and the tagging on labs. So for instance, if this was my Millie Maker set, I could say DK Millie, and maybe my Millie Maker set would have 2 players under 10%, or it would have 4 players from the same game, or whatever the rules are. You save that tag, and then you can access it later on during the week, and you can then add more lineups to your set, or just save the lineups and clear them from here and then start over. Different ways you can do that on labs. They've got great tools to be able to help you do that. Does your stack size approach change at all for lineups you plan to enter in single entry 3-max or 20-max versus the 150 max tournaments? I know in general you build one lineup per entry you have, but is it just per your randoms which end up in which contest? So sort of getting back to the previous question as well. The single entry and 3-max stuff I usually hand build. If it's low dollar stuff, I might randomize that as well. Like a $5 single entry is probably just as worth my time as the $9 slant, and so I'll randomize those. But when I'm playing like the Spy, when I'm playing like the Power Sweep, Luxury Box, any of those high dollar contests, I'm hand building those. And does my approach change? It doesn't change too much. I'm trying to accomplish the same things. I don't have as rigid of rules in place, and I know the smaller contest fields in general, I might not necessarily have to go as off the board. So like a Cam Akers play for me last week was an MME play. I don't think I used him in any of my single entry 3-max type builds. And so, discussions like that kind of are how I go about it. But that was it for the Q&A questions. I felt like these were a little bit more strategy inducing and deserved and belonged behind the paywall. Hopefully showing some of the differences in RotoTracker and how to look at your entries over time and how you go about assessing your play was helpful. I certainly want to let you guys know the things and tools that I use that have helped me make a better DFS player. I don't have any promotional stuff with RotoTracker. We do have the ETR promotion with Fantasy Labs, which you can get the $30 for the rest of the season to be able to have access to our projections being uploaded. But these are the tools I use to make myself a better DFS player. Those are your guys' questions that I can answer to hopefully help you guys become better DFS players. That's it for me. Best of luck to all of you in week 5, and I'll be back at some point with another screencast.